Hello, equity agents. Happy New Year. I hope you guys had a great holiday and that 2026 is off to a great start. Today in this video, we are reviewing the 2026 contract changes that went into effect on January 1st of this year. As I say with every contract changes video, this video will be the quick highlights of the most important pieces, but I definitely still recommend taking an official contracts changes class. I could create a 3-hour video outlining every single contract change, but the downside is you wouldn't get continuing education credit for watching that video. So in order to thoroughly understand all the changes that have taken place, please take a contract changes course. But in the meantime, I hope this video serves as a quick guide, a reference to all the substantial changes that did take place. And there were a handful of them, some really good things that we'll cover in this video. So today we're going to review the listing agreements, the exclusive right to sell, and the exclusive right to buy. We'll review the contract to buy and sell, the seller's property disclosure, which had some big changes, the inspection objection, the post-closing occupancy agreement, the agreement to revive contract, and then the extension or termination of contract as well. Those are probably the most substantial changes. There were a handful of other additions or changes, new forms, but those were geared towards manufactured homes. And as you guys know, we don't partake in transactions when it's a mobile home that is not attached to real property. Otherwise, a mobile home is just considered personal property. It wouldn't count as a real estate transaction if that property is not fixed to the land below it. So we don't need to spend any time on those manufactured contracts. So without any further ado, let's dive right in. I'm going to share my screen with you really quick. Okay, starting with the exclusive right to sell, you will see me skip over some of the red line, or in this case, green line changes that have been made. I'm just focusing on the big substantial pieces today. So we're going to scroll down. First section of green that I want to address. So the first section where we see green, section 3.6.2, not a big concern for us as we do not allow property management. They've added the rights and duties owed under the seller listing contract shall also apply to lease of the property. So all the items in the exclusive right to sell apply to leases. But the big takeaway, why I stopped here, is to remind you that we don't allow property management. And on personal rental properties of your own, you wouldn't fill out an exclusive right to sell because equity wouldn't be the brokerage associated for those services. You would do a lease agreement between you and your tenant separate from equity since we don't allow property management. So just a quick note and reminder on that. Moving on to 3.7, the listing period. I do like this change. They've only added a little bit of verbiage at the end. So we know about listing periods. Your services take place between the listing period start date and the listing period end date. And then they've added, I'm going to read that last sentence, broker must continue to assist in the completion of any sale or lease of the property for which compensation is due and payable to brokerage firm under Section 7 of the seller listing contract, even after expiration of the listing period. We get that question constantly. For example, my listing agreement expires, or my listing period expires on December 31st, but we're under contract on a property that is closing on January 15th. The question then is, do I need to complete a new listing agreement or extend the listing agreement? Now the verbiage is automatically baked into the contract. You technically do not have to extend anything if you're under contract. And those same services outlined in your exclusive right to sell are still in place even after the listing period expires. Should you? Probably. I would just still do a listing contract amend extend to push that listing period end date to January 15th or January 16th in that example that I gave previously. So good change there. All right, moving on to the next big change, probably the most substantial change this year that many of you have already reached out about, and that is the removal of Section 5.3. Section 5.3 was the verbiage that allowed you as agents to share confidential information about your clients with me, your employing broker, with the intention of supervision. So they removed this entirely, which was a bit controversial. Long story short, The Division of Real Estate and the Colorado Real Estate Commission made an argument that in the rare event of certain transactions, if an agent shares confidential information with an employing broker, it could be a conflict of interest. And again, this is very rare circumstances, as in maybe you double end a transaction with another equity agent. And so you both on each side, the listing side and the buy side, have sensitive information that you share with me. Well, how can Dora regulate the guidance that I give based on really confidential information and motives of either side of transaction? You guys don't need to panic because we are currently waiting for the Frascona law firm to send us a new disclosure form that essentially re-adds this verbiage to the contract, allows you to obtain confidential information from your clients so you can share that with me and I can supervise accordingly. The big takeaway is that there needs to be informed consent before you obtain that confidential information. And that's what that Frascona form is going to entail. Truly, I'm not concerned about this. There are ways that I can delegate and provide supervision in that rare instance that you do double end a transaction and I do see a conflict of interest. That's where I might designate another manager, maybe Greg Tiffin, the backup on our support line. I can designate somebody to manage or supervise one side of that transaction while I'm supervising the other side of that transaction so that wires aren't crossed. There's two supervisors in each corner of those transactions. And that's my job, is to watch out for those conflicts. So in the event that you do double end a transaction with another equity agent, please let me know just so it's on my radar. I keep pretty close tabs on things as it is, so I'll probably see it. But that's the big takeaway. We'll have a new Frascona clause or disclosure form that you will need to fill out with your exclusive right to sell and exclusive right to buy that gives you the authority to share confidential information from your clients with me as your employing broker. The last comment, this doesn't even concern me that much based on how little it happens, but this disclosure that I'm including, that I'm making you guys complete, I want that included mainly because you might share confidential information with me without even realizing it. And that's almost a bigger problem than the conflict of interest that the commission raises within a transaction. So you guys call me up on the support line and share things left and right, motivations and buyer or seller circumstances. And now that this has been removed, Section 5.3 has been removed, that could get us into hot water. So that's why it's important to have that Frascona disclosure included with your listing agreements, because then you're getting consent from your clients, from your sellers and your buyers, that you can share confidential information with me with the intention of supervision. So that's a lot. I'll cover more of that at a sales meeting, but long story short, don't panic about this 5.3 being removed. Just be sure that you're having your clients sign the new Frascona disclosure that we're currently getting coded and built into CTM right now. That's called the Confidential Information Disclosure. We'll have more on that later. Moving right along, the only other changes with the removal of 5.3, they've had to revise the section numbers, so you'll see some green there. And then 5.8, I like this change. So previously, it was when asked, the broker will or will not share information about other offers received on a listing. They just tweaked this verbiage slightly so it reads, seller does or does not consent to broker's disclosure to prospective buyers and cooperating brokers the existence of other offers on the property. If neither box is checked, seller does not consent to broker's disclosure of such information. I like this revision because the way it was previously written, the broker will or will not share information. It almost made it assumed that the listing agent was always going to share or was always not going to share that information with the word will or will not. Now it's does or does not consent, meaning you don't have to share information even if the does box is checked. It's just saying that the seller gives you consent to share information on other offers received to potential buyers or buyers' agents if that circumstances arises where you need to do that. So good change, positive change. 9.3.2, pretty easy. This is just in regards to the use of videos and pictures, and with the exception of the following areas. So they've just cleaned up the verbiage and they've created a new section specifically for the use of videos and pictures. And if there are any areas where the seller does not want you to take pictures or videos, that's where you'd include them in section 9.3.2. Earnest money, they've just made some slight verbiage changes. Earnest money must be submitted in the form of X. So they've just made it a little bit more substantial. Earnest money must be submitted. And then funds electronically transferred, wire transferred for the seller proceeds, 11.6. They've deleted the verbiage on wire fraud. And then down below, a section we're going to get to here shortly, they've included a full paragraph now on wire fraud. So they've just moved that wire fraud information into its own respective section of the contract, which we're going to see in a second here. Moving right along, inclusions and exclusions. They've just added one minor word. Inclusions attached. All of these items are included unless specifically excluded under the exclusions. So just the word specific. You need to be very, very specific with your inclusions and exclusions by notating them in the respective sections of the contract. The same was done down here in inclusions not attached. They've just added the word specifically. Pretty easy. Same thing with leased items. We see these occasionally. The following leased items are included in the transaction. Just a verbiage change. They've removed part of the transaction and revised it to included in the transaction. And then similar changes with parking and storage facilities in section 13.4. The use or ownership of the following parking facilities are included. And then water rights. They've just cleaned these up. The quick change, they've removed 13.5.2, which was other rights relating to water. They had that listed in the contract before some of the other options for water rights that you could check on, check boxes for. So all they've done, they've just moved it as the last option. They've taken section 13.5.2 and moved it to the very bottom of the water section and made it 13.5.4, other rights relating to water, where you can list those if there are any water rights outside of what the contract already includes with checkboxes. All right. Some changes here. Pretty easy. Evidence of title. They've just cleaned up the verbiage, notating that title services. It's customary for the seller to furnish to buyer at seller's expense a current commitment and an owner's title insurance policy in an amount equal to the purchase price. So that's pretty much all they've changed. It's customary for the seller to provide that to a buyer. But then the big addition, this term is negotiable in the contract to buy and sell, and there are other title products available that may be requested by buyer or buyer's lender. So I like this change. They're just putting it on the seller's radar early in the listing agreement, saying it's customary for the seller to provide a title insurance policy, title commitment, but you might see a negotiable offer in the contract to buy and sell when you accept an offer for different title products, different levels of insurance, and it's a negotiable item in the contract to buy and sell. All right, 16.1 through 16.3, those are new changes. They've just cleaned things up a little bit to make it easy to identify whether or not a property is or is not within an association. So association membership, seller represents the property is or is not located within a common interest community. There's a clearly outlined section for association assessments now, 16.2. You put the cost in 16.2 for those assessments. And then the biggest change, 16.3, they've clearly identified seller is to provide documents. Seller acknowledges that seller will be required to cause the association documents to be provided to buyer at seller's expense on or before any applicable deadline established in a final contract between a buyer and a seller. Same thought process. They're just getting the seller ready. Hey, you're within an association. We've outlined that. And when you start receiving offers, be aware there's going to be a date and deadline where you have to provide all of the association paperwork and documentation as part of the contract with the buyer. So good change. I like that. No big changes here, other than if broker's in default or if the seller's in default. They're just specifying that the seller's notice of cancellation of the contract must be made in writing. Previous versions weren't that specific. Now they're saying if either party, the agent or the seller in this case, terminates the contract, the termination must be made in writing, and you must clearly state why the opposing party has breached the contract. Pretty easy. Yeah, that pretty much leads us to the end here. Disclosure of settlement costs, Section 2022. You recall you have to provide at least 3 recommendations for title companies and lenders and inspectors. That same rule applies, but they did make clear verbiage that says broker cannot require seller to use a certain settlement service provider, and seller can shop and select similar services from other companies. Seller is ultimately responsible for selecting, qualifying, and paying for the settlement service providers who provide such services to seller. So it's just that much more apparent to the seller in writing. Seller, you get to choose these settlement services, but it's the seller's choice. And then I think the last big piece, wire and other frauds, as I mentioned earlier, they just really bulked up the wire fraud paragraph. Just talks about wire fraud, significant risks in real estate transactions, anytime the seller is supplying confidential information, social security numbers, bank account numbers, transferring or receiving funds, seller should provide the information in person or in another secure manner. Wire instructions should only be sent by a closing company to the seller via encrypted emails, web portals that require authentication. So you guys get this. We've talked about wire fraud. We even have our own disclosure that you sign separately. But that's the big point. They've just worked more of that information about wire fraud and the potential risks directly into the listing agreement. The question will come up, with this new paragraph, do I still need to have the equity wire fraud disclosure completed and signed? The answer is yes. And please note, any of those requirements for paperwork or compliance services, 98% of the time, it's to protect you as agents. And that's why we require all those additional disclosures to protect you and to protect equity in the event we do run up against wire fraud. You now had 2 opportunities to chat with your client about wire fraud, which alleviates some of that risk from you and from equity. And then just one more quick note, Section 27 mediation. Same thing. Any party requesting mediation must deliver written notice requesting mediation to the other party as provided. Previous contract wasn't that specific. Any mediation, arbitration, just like the terminations up above that we talked about, everything must be submitted in writing if there's a dispute. That's the exclusive right to sell. All right, moving right along to the exclusive right to buy, you will see parallels to everything we just covered in the exclusive right to sell. A lot of the changes to the exclusive right to buy, we've already kind of covered on the sell side. They're just tailored to the buy side now. So let's dive right in here. So same thing, 3.5.2, that applies to a lease now. Again, you guys never do lease contracts, lease terms with the buyer to find a rental property, so you don't have to worry about that, nor do we allow it because we don't allow property management. I think that brings us to, 5.3. So again, the big takeaway for 5.3, sharing confidential information with the employing broker, that has been removed. We're waiting on the Frascona informed consent disclosure where you will have your buyer, in this case, sign another form that allows you to obtain confidential information from your buyer and share it with me in the event that you need to for supervision purposes. That's the big takeaways. There is an additional form and potentially some additional verbiage that you can paste into your additional provisions. I'm still waiting on Frascona to supply that document to us, but it basically re-adds this section back into the contract. Let me know if you have questions on that. We can chat further. Okay, super easy. Moving on. Section 10, Owners Association. Just another notation that HOAs, homeowners associations, exist. Similar to the sell side, we kind of warned them up front and told them there's going to be some negotiation and some documents you have to provide if your home is in an association. And similarly, we're telling the buyer, that some properties may be located within a common interest community, and if so, buyer will be required to be a member of that owners association for the community and will be subject to the covenants of the association, including, but not limited to, the requirement to pay association assessments. That's great. That should be in there and right up front. Gives you one more talking point with your buyer so they know exactly what they're getting into as they search for properties out there. They've added more buyer due diligence verbiage straight into the listing agreement. So Section 11 is now buyer due diligence. Buyers advised to perform all appropriate due diligence, including but not limited to verifying the accuracy and completeness of the statements made by the seller or seller's broker, and any information regarding the property contained in the multiple listing service, marketing materials, owners association documents, or any other sources. Again, I like that. And it's telling the buyer they need to do their due diligence and double check all of the marketing in the MLS, maybe on the cards laid out at the showing. It's their responsibility to confirm those details. We do have our buyer due diligence checklist disclosure on the buy side. That's an equity-specific form. Yes, you still have to fill that out. Again, that alleviates liability and risk for you. That's probably one of my favorite disclosures we've ever created, is that buyer due diligence disclosure checklist. And that's on the buy side transactions. You do still have to complete that, even though they've enhanced Section 11 there. And then super easy, same thing from the exclusive right to sell. Buyer's notice of cancellation must be made in writing, and the basis, including the basis of cancellation. And same thing, if the buyer's in default, brokerage firm, so you as the buyer's agent, must cancel the contract in writing and submit your reasoning why you're canceling. Pretty easy. All right, and then that brings us down to Section 15, disclosure of buyer's identity. Nothing too detrimental, but buyer does or does not grant broker permission to disclose buyer's identity to third parties without prior written consent of buyer. The change they made, if neither box is checked, buyer does not provide such permission. So you just have to make sure one of these boxes is checked. Most commonly, the does box is usually checked. That just allows you to share information with the title company and the lender and the appraiser. Really, the only time that you would check does not is if you're working with a high-profile buyer. If you're working with a Broncos player or a celebrity sports figure, that's the only time that we really check the does not box, is to protect the identity. And then Section 16, a similar statement. Broker cannot require buyer to use certain settlement services. Buyer can shop and select similar services from other companies. Buyer is ultimately responsible for selecting, qualifying, and paying for settlement services. Same exact changes that we saw in the exclusive right to sell. This applies to lenders, inspectors. The buyer is able to shop around and choose those settlement services. And then Section 17, same exact changes we already reviewed, just a more robust breakdown of wire fraud. Easy. We don't even have to cover that again. Mediation, there's a lot of green. Same takeaway as the exclusive right to sell, Section 21. Any party requesting mediation must do so in writing. Easy. And that's it. We're done. Listing contracts are completed. Okay, moving right along with the contract to buy and sell. And I'm happy to say our biggest contract didn't get too many changes, but there are still a handful of things that we need to review together. So let's dive right into that one. No changes to the dates and deadlines. Everything's there. A couple verbiage removals, nothing worth talking about. I don't think we have anything for a little while now. I think we're getting to Section 10. No, special taxing district. Not a huge change. They're just making it more apparent that special taxing districts exist. The quick context, there was a new statute that was put into play. I can't even quote which statute that was, but there needs to be more disclosure of special taxing districts and metropolitan districts, just so the buyer knows that there's additional costs associated with some of those properties. So that reads, actions by a special taxing or metropolitan district pursuant to its authority to issue debt, impose mill levies, and impose fees, rates, tolls, penalties, or other charges may increase costs to residents living in the special taxing or metropolitan district. So they're just telling that buyer and that seller, so everybody's on the same page, there could be additional costs through a special taxing district that you want to be aware of. And then now I think section 10 is the next one. Yes. So this is a subtle but important distinction to talk about. Section 10.1, seller's property disclosure. So this is in regards to the seller's property disclosure and the adverse material facts completed on that seller's property disclosure as they exist at the time of the seller's property disclosure deadline. So one quick distinction. So it says, on or before the seller's property disclosure deadline, seller agrees to deliver to buyer the most current version of the applicable Colorado Real Estate Commission seller's property disclosure form completed by seller to seller's actual knowledge and current as of the date of the seller's property disclosure. It's kind of a standard protocol right now is we have our sellers complete a seller's property disclosure, and then we add it as a supplemental document to the MLS. And if anything changes from the date that listing was added to the MLS and maybe a new material fact presents itself, that seller is on the hook to provide a seller's property disclosure with all of the current actual knowledge and material facts about the property as of the date of the seller's property disclosure deadline outlined in the contract above. So in other words, you just have to make sure that that seller's property disclosure is up to date, and you always want to send it when you're representing the seller. You always want to make sure that you send it prior to the seller's property disclosure deadline, and don't assume that it's already been delivered based on the buyer's agent receiving it from the MLS. Send the seller's property disclosure and notate that the seller's property disclosure must be up to date with the most current actual knowledge known by the seller as of the date of the seller's property disclosure deadline. Moving right along. 10.5, insurability. They've only added in buyer's sole subjective discretion, which is in regards to buyer has the right to terminate the contract on or before the property insurance termination deadline based on, in buyer's sole subjective discretion, any unsatisfactory provision of the availability terms and conditions for insurance. So they've just moved it. Nothing has changed other than they've moved it up in that sentence. Buyer can terminate the contract in the event they can't secure insurance in their sole subjective discretion. Easy. And I think that's it, aside from one minor change to earnest money dispute. They've just added, under earnest money dispute, section 23, they've added the earnest money release form as the example of the earnest money holder must release the earnest money following receipt of written mutual instruction, for example, an earnest money release form. They've specified that form. Pretty easy. 3, done. We're moving forward. Okay, the next form to use, which hopefully you don't need to use this form too much, but it does happen occasionally. It's the agreement to revive contract. This form is used when a contract terminates for any reason and the buyer and seller want to bring it back to life. I'm happy with the changes. The quick, big change they've made to this form is they've added a dates and deadlines table to this form, which is so convenient because before you guys would have to fill out the agreement to revive and you only had an additional amendments section. So that's where you would have to outline any changes, including dates and deadlines, and it was very, very cumbersome. So now you have a dates and deadlines table. If you're bringing the contract back to life, you can establish all new dates and deadlines. Wherever you were at in that previous contract that fell through, you have the ability to create all new dates and deadlines in a nice, neat, organized dates and deadlines table, just like the contract to buy and sell. Really easy. And then you have other dates and deadlines set forth in this contract. So if you guys had specific dates and deadlines kind of outside of what the contract already includes, you'd notate those there if there are changes to them. And then additional amendments, they've just moved that down. That's the same section where you can notate any other conditions or changes to the original contract when this one goes back in full force. So the last comment, just about contract termination in general. If a contract terminates and you guys need to revise more than 2 items, I just recommend doing an all new contract. So it can be very confusing when you bring a revive into play and you have all these changes, so much so that you have to reference the old contract and you just get lost in the weeds. So as a rule of thumb, if you're changing more than 2 items, it's a good practice just to complete an all-new contract and avoid the agreement to revive. And then in your dates and deadlines, you can just put completed in all of the dates and deadlines that have already passed and been fulfilled from the previous contract. So the next one to talk about, which makes sense after what we just reviewed with the agreement to revive, is the extension or termination of contract. Be very careful when you use this form. I've seen this form used incorrectly in the past, and it causes more problems for the transaction. And I guess the easiest way to set the scene for this form, you're going to use it when there's an ultimatum, as in, if the seller doesn't agree to X, Y, or Z, then the contract is going to terminate. That's the only time you'd use this extension or termination of contract. Otherwise, if you need to terminate a contract for a clear as day reason, use the notice to terminate. It's much more concise in saying that this contract is terminated because of X, Y, or Z. I just want to make that distinction between the notice to terminate as a declaration of this contract is terminating because of versus the extension or termination of contract is used as an ultimatum. Seller, if you don't agree to X, Y, or Z by X date, then the contract's going to automatically terminate. But the big changes, they just notate that all of the contracts, so the contract to buy and sell, the contract to buy and sell income residential, the contract to buy and sell land, they all have uniform dates and deadlines now, which is actually really nice because the contract to buy and sell land, for example, had different dates and deadlines, many dates and deadlines that weren't included in the contract to buy and sell residential for a standard residential transaction. So they're just saying all section numbers noted in the reference column are universal references to the commission-approved contract to buy and sell residential, foreclosure, income residential, commercial, and land. So the 4 or 5 different types of contract to buy and sell contracts that exist. And then it says, unless otherwise indicated in the event section. So the abbreviation CBS1 means the contract to buy and sell residential. That's what those deadlines pertain to, is the residential contract. The abbreviation CBS2 means contract to buy and sell income residential. The abbreviation CBS3 means contract to buy and sell commercial, and so on and so forth. And as we scroll, you'll see what they mean when they have this dates and deadlines table. For example, lead-based paint disclosure deadline, it only applies to the CBS1, CBS2, and CBSF1. So that's all they're outlining. There's a dates and deadlines table, and they've outlined that certain deadlines only exist for certain contracts. So you don't have to write in anything manually as it pertains to whatever contract you're using in your transaction. Okay, that leaves us with just 2 documents left to review. Post-closing occupancy agreement, and last but not least, the seller's property disclosure, which we'll probably spend the most time on. So the quick portion of red under Section 2 agreement, the rights and remedies of the parties under this agreement will survive this agreement. So not a big change. They're just saying if the post-closing occupancy agreement ends and there's still unresolved disputes that need to be handled, the terms, the rights and the remedies more specifically, of the parties under this post-closing occupancy agreement survive. Section 3, possession, they've just added specifically, buyer and seller acknowledge that if buyer intends to occupy the property as buyer's principal residence, the term may not exceed 60 days after closing. We all kind of knew that, but it was never really declared anywhere. A post-closing occupancy agreement only covers 60 days after closing. If the seller is going to remain in the property longer than 60 days, that's when the buyer and seller would need to complete a formal rental agreement, a lease agreement. So just keep that in mind. Post-closing occupancy agreement is only covers 60 days of occupancy. And now you've got that reminder in Section 3. Really easy. And then I think all the other changes are pretty easy. Yeah, they've just removed some verbiage, made things read a little bit clearer. They have removed the verbiage, seller agrees to reimburse buyer for buyer's reasonable attorney fees and indemnify and hold the buyer harmless for all injury, loss, claim, or damage to any person or property caused by seller, seller's family, or invitees that is not paid by seller's insurance. That didn't quite fit the right section. Why are we talking about reimbursement and attorney fees and all that stuff under seller's renter's insurance policy? So that's why they got rid of it. And then they've added or changed section 15, mutual indemnification. That then reads, seller and buyer agree to indemnify, defend, and hold harmless the other party from and against any claims due to any injury, loss, claim, or damage to any person or property, including reasonable attorney fees caused by the other party or such party's family, licensees, or invitees that is not paid by such party's insurance, if any. And you'll notice they just took that verbiage and they've moved it down to its own section. Section 15, mutual indemnification. Seller and buyer agree to indemnify, defend, and hold harmless the other party from and against any claims due to any injury, loss, claim, or damage to any person or property, including reasonable attorney's fees caused by the other party or such party's family, licensees, or invitees that is not paid by such party's insurance, if any. So in other words, unless insurance is going to pay for something bad or something that goes wrong during the post-closing occupancy agreement, both parties agree to hold each other harmless and only use insurance as a way to resolve those issues. And the other big change, which is probably already on your radar since we spoke about it so much at the meetings and over the support line, security deposits. There's a new bill that was passed, and security deposits now can no longer exceed 2 times the amount of rent. And the problem that we were running into, well, what if there isn't rent being charged? Well, then you can't collect a security deposit. And so that's exactly what they said in section 16. In order to collect a security deposit, landlord must collect a monthly rent payment. Seller agrees that a security deposit in the amount of X, and then they've added parentheses, not to exceed the amount of 2 times the monthly rent payment payable to buyer will be paid at closing and held by buyer. So in other words, you can no longer do 0 rent and collect a security deposit. That used to be kind of the standard with a lot of these post-closing occupancy agreements. You now need to include rent, whatever that amount might be, and then your security deposit cannot exceed 2 times the amount of that rent. Good change. It's clear as day now right there up front. Okay, and we've made it to the last document, the seller's property disclosure. We've saved the best for last. Some changes to this. I think the intention was to make it easier for a seller to disclose material facts actually known about a property. But because of the way some of the questions are asked, we just have to slow down and make sure that our sellers truly understand that disclosure is imperative, and that's Colorado state law. And there's a couple of different ways they can disclose information. But let's look at the red text. So one thing we've already kind of talked about with our contract to buy and sell changes. Seller states that the information contained in the seller's property disclosure is correct to seller's current actual knowledge as of the date signed by the seller. So as of the date the seller signs this seller's property disclosure, they're attesting that all the information is correct and accurate, which that means if anything changes, as you guys already know, they would need to complete a new seller's property disclosure to update that date that they've signed this document. It then reads, if the contract to buy and sell requires seller to complete this seller's property disclosure, this form must be fully completed to seller's current actual knowledge as of the date of the seller's property disclosure deadline in the contract. So I'll pause there for a second. We already talked about the seller's property disclosure deadline. The seller needs to fill out this form based on the current actual knowledge based on the seller's property disclosure deadline as of the date of the seller's property disclosure deadline. But this just said, if the contract to buy and sell requires the seller to complete this seller's property disclosure, as you know, the seller doesn't have to complete the seller's property disclosure. But now we need to look at that seller's property disclosure deadline a lot more closely, because if there's a seller's property disclosure deadline included in the contract to buy and sell, the seller has accepted the offer and agreed to fill out a seller's property disclosure. That's a big difference. In the previous contract, even if there was a seller's property disclosure deadline, the seller still kind of had the option not to fill out that document. So in other words, this makes it a little bit more sticky. If there's a seller's property disclosure deadline in the contract, the seller is agreeing to fill out a seller's property disclosure. So if you get the seller who does not want to fill out this form and refuses to fill out this form, you better make sure that there's no seller's property disclosure deadline in the offer that you accept. Now, a big follow-up to everything I just said, it's the Colorado state law that a seller discloses actual material facts, known material facts about the property in writing. So just because they don't fill out this seller's property disclosure doesn't mean that that law doesn't apply to the seller. The seller still needs to disclose actual material fact. And probably the number one question surrounding this is the seller didn't live in the property. It was a rental, or it was owned by another family member. And therefore they feel they don't need to fill out this form or disclose anything. That's not true. Even if the seller didn't live in the property, maybe it was a rental, they still know a lot more than they might think about the property, especially if they were the landlord. Maybe something broke, and even though the seller wasn't living in the property, that tenant called the seller, landlord, and said, the water heater broke. I need you to replace it. That's now actual knowledge that that seller has, and it needs to be disclosed on a seller's property disclosure. So make sure you're taking the time to articulate this to a seller on when and how to fill out a seller's property disclosure, and push a little bit. It's Colorado state law. And I always love the tagline I use with you guys so much on the support line. There has never been a lawsuit for providing too much information on a seller's property disclosure. Lawsuits happen when a seller doesn't provide any information or not enough information on a seller's property disclosure. That's probably the safest rule to live by when it comes to disclosure and completing a seller's property disclosure. And I think these changes make it more important now. So I hope that makes sense. Reading the red text further, any changes to the disclosures herein must be disclosed by seller to buyer promptly after discovery. In the event seller discovers a new adverse material fact after completing this SPD, seller must disclose in writing any such new adverse material fact to buyer. We already knew that. If anything comes to light, it needs to be disclosed in an email and an amend extend, or fill out a new seller's property disclosure. That's the best practice. Additionally, broker is authorized to deliver a copy of this seller's property disclosure to prospective buyers. They've just roped you in. You're authorized. You can deliver this seller's property disclosure when you're the listing agent to the buyer. And then they've added, seller and buyer understand that this SPD is not a warranty or guarantee of any kind by the seller or by any broker or agent representing the seller. Property inspection services may be purchased and are advisable. This SPD is not intended as a substitute for an inspection of the property. Buyers are encouraged to obtain their own professional inspections. So I like that. It's just, this is information to help a buyer make an educated decision on whether or not they should purchase this property. They still need to conduct their own independent inspection and do their due diligence to make sure they can use the property in the way that they plan on using the property. So as long as you're explaining it to a seller that way, it's just a disclosure of information, things that you know about the property that would help a buyer make an informed decision on purchasing the property. Don't overthink it. Stay in that territory with it, and you'll be just fine. So they've also added a couple other things that I do like. There's now a section, seller is or is not currently occupying the property. So they just quickly check a box whether they're living in the property or not. And then if seller is not currently occupying the property, date the seller last occupied the property. They can include that when they last lived in the home. And then during any period when seller has not occupied the property was vacant or occupied by someone other than the seller. So kind of leaning into everything I said, the seller can no longer use it was a rental property. I didn't live there as a cop-out for not completing this seller's property disclosure. There are now boxes that specifically check, and then we can easily identify whether or not the seller is filling things out based on whether the home was vacant or that they've lived in it or occupied by another person, a tenant. So, all right. And then we don't have to spend too much time going through every single change, but I just want to notate a couple things that they've changed in the disclosures section. One quick note at the top now. Note, the contract, not the seller's property disclosure, determines whether an item is included or excluded in the sale. If there's any inconsistency between the seller's property disclosure and the contract controls. In other words, if there's an inclusion that's mentioned in the seller's property disclosure, but it was not specifically mentioned in inclusions in the contract, a lift in the garage, for example, I don't know. If the seller mentions that lift in the garage on the seller's property disclosure, that doesn't automatically mean that it's included in the sale of the property. You would revert to the inclusions section of the contract to buy and sell and notate that that lift was included in inclusions. That's what will dictate whether or not that piece of property is included in the sale. So the last couple things as I go into how these disclosure sections have been revised, keep in mind that it's if you, the seller, know of any of the following problems ever existing, check the yes column. That's another common question we get through the support line is, if there was mold in the property, but it's been completely remediated, do I need to disclose it on the seller's property disclosure? Yes. You need to tell that buyer that there was mold in the property, but it was professionally remediated. It was taken care of. And that's because of this ever-existing verbiage. The seller needs to tell the new buyer or potential buyers of any condition that ever existed on the property. And so I'll scroll through here. You'll just see they've made it a lot more detailed. There's certain sections for more things, and there's more specific questions that are asked to the seller. Structural problems with improvements, structural supports or reinforcements added. Moisture including but not limited to leakage, seepage in the basement or crawl space. Settling, moving, cracking, heaving of any of the following. So I feel like every year they revise this, they're just adding more categories or more questions or more disclosure sections in hopes of making it easier for the seller to complete. Roof, for example, do you know of the following on the property? If yes, provide the requested information in the comments. Indicate the age of the roof in the comments. So if you know that, yes, and tell more in the comments section. Indicate roof material. Roof is under warranty. Date of warranty expiration. Warranty is transferable. They've added yes or no boxes to even further confirm what that seller might know. Roof work done while under current roof warranty. Date of work completed. So you can see we don't have to spend too much time other than they've added more detail for a seller to disclose information. Now there's more specific information on electrical. Is it a 220 volt service? Electrical service amps, landscape lighting, cable TV provider, internet provider, solar panels. That's where you can also disclose if they're owned or leased with additional information. Wind generators, security systems, doorbells, internet wiring, carbon monoxide alarms, built-in sound systems. So go ahead. I won't keep you much longer. Just go ahead and scroll that seller's property disclosure and you'll see there's just a lot more detail added. And the seller needs to slow down and take the time to provide as much information as possible. Okay, so thank you for sticking with me, and I hope this video was helpful. As I mentioned, there were a couple documents that I excluded from this overview. As always, if you have questions or want to chat further about something, never hesitate to reach out via the support line for specific circumstances that you're encountering. But I feel this video covers the basics, the most commonly asked questions, and I wanted to make use of our time together over this video as beneficial as possible. So all of the best in 2026. I'm really excited for what the new year holds. And of course, if you need anything else, please don't hesitate to reach out. Take care. Thanks for watching.